Welcome everyone to week 3 of Isaiah and the Book of Mormon. I have to be honest here with you. Today we're going to be going over Isaiah 4 through 6, and I'm a little intimidated because I know how much I'm lacking really in some of the scholarship when it comes to this. Compared to Abraham Gileadi, making certain connections is not going to be my forte. But what I do have to offer here is what I've been taught by the Spirit. And that said, I would still highly recommend going to IsaiahExplained.com as shown here, or using their app at Isaiah Institute, things like that, and listening to his analytical commentary to get more out of this, because there is so much more you could be getting out of this. And I'm just praying that I'll be led by the Spirit, not knowing beforehand where I will go, so that I will speak to the things of Christ that will lead you ultimately to Him. Okay, so let's get into this. We kind of skimmed over Isaiah 1 through 3. We didn't really dig into that last week. So I'll be referring back to a lot of that as we go through this, because it is crucial to connect all these ideas and images together that Isaiah intended to be connected. So let's start off, first of all, with Isaiah 4, verse 1. We're just going to start going through this, so feel free to read along on the screen here with me if you're watching the video, or on your own through IsaiahExplained.com or one of the other Abraham Gileadi translations. Verse 1, chapter 4. 7 women will take hold of one man in that day and say, "We will eat our own food, wear our own clothes, only let us be called by your name. Take away our reproach." Now, what day is this talking about? Well, if you go back to chapter 3, it's talking about this day of Jehovah. For the wicked, it's not going to be a great day, but it will be a great day for the righteous. But in that day, it's talking about how your men shall be felled by the sword, and your might overthrown in war. Your gateways will lie bereaved. And of course, as we've mentioned before, and it states very clearly in chapter 2, this is a latter-day prophecy. So when it's speaking of these types of things that happened in Judea and Jerusalem, where the Babylonians came in and just, eradicated their civilization in a lot of ways, and of course enslaved them, is ultimately what happened. A lot of them were killed, but a lot of them were enslaved. Isaiah is applying this prophecy now to us in this day. So he's saying that you have a people here who are in Zion, or a promised land, whose land was full of silver and gold. Like Nephi said, when they came to the promised land, there was all this wealth there, essentially. But you haven't lived up to your covenants to the Lord. And because you are a covenant people, there are either covenant blessings or covenant curses that go along with being these chosen people. And what is happening to a portion of the people now is they're receiving those covenant curses because they are not living up to those promises that they made. And so the Lord can't fulfill the promises, Jehovah, right, that He made with them. It just doesn't work that way. And so all the protection, and we'll go into this in a minute, but everything that they had is going to be taken away from them because they're not living up to these covenants. So in that day, or that great day of Jehovah, it's saying now 7 women will take hold of one man, and they're saying we can provide for our own needs. This is a good thing. This is talking about a righteous people here, and of course 7. Let's say this. When it comes to interpreting Isaiah, the literal translation is usually the first one that you want to start with. And then you can move on to more of the metaphor and also any personal application. So there could be a literal translation or interpretation of this, which is that your men are felled, and so you're going to have a lot of women left over. But when it talks about taking hold of one man, a man, who is that man? Well, whose name is it that we want to take upon us? Who is it that takes away our reproach, our stain, right? It's Jehovah. And 7, obviously, is a highly symbolic number. To 7 in Hebrew is a way of saying to covenant. When you covenant, you seven something. There's examples of this, like with Abraham, where it's a well of 7 and things like that. This is a covenant word. So these people are making a covenant here. And of course, it's also a number that has to do with a multiplicity or completion of some sort. So this is actually a good thing. In that day, the plant of Jehovah shall be beautiful and glorious, and the earth's fruit, the pride and glory of the survivors of Israel. So these are survivors from this catastrophe that happens. They are the remnant, as you would say, right? And of course, in 3, it says that. Then shall they who are left in Zion. If you recall back in chapter 1, it says Zion. Well, let me just show you really quick. The daughter of Zion, so again, that female imagery, is left like a shelter in a vineyard, a hut in a melon field, a city under siege. Well, Jerusalem was under siege for a period of time by the Assyrians, but they were protected because of this Davidic covenant under King Hezekiah, which we'll go into more in a later lesson. So these are the survivors, the ones who are left behind, as opposed to the others, which we'll see, which were part of this exile or this really unfortunate forced exodus. So those who remain are called holy. Remember those levels that we discussed of people who've ascended to different categories of spirituality or closeness in their relationship to God? These are Zion level people. They are holy. They are saints. They are sanctified ones. And these are all of those who were inscribed to be among the living at Jerusalem. Living could be a really loaded word there. I haven't looked up the Hebrew, but I'm going to assume here that it's some version of the word hayah, and that is to be alive. It's a word in reference to Yahweh when he says, I am that I am. So again, there's a great level of spiritual ascendance and blessings here. Verse 4, this shall be when my Lord has washed away the excrement of the women of Zion. Remember before it was, the women of Zion are haughty and they, don't get it, right? And the Lord's going to strip away all that finery. Well, now these are people who are living up to those covenants, and they're cleansed, and Jerusalem is cleansed of its blood. Again, Jerusalem refers to that group of people, of its blood shed. What blood was shed? Well, it goes on to say, in the spirit of justice by a burning wind. There's a lot to unwrap here, but let me first say that this idea of a burning wind or this heat or this fire is a motif throughout Isaiah. And if you click on our little link here, a chaos motif and pseudonym of the end-time king of Assyria. So all these kinds of words can either be the good kind of fire, the good kind of light, or its antithesis. So the good one would be this servant or this Moses type figure of Jehovah who helps these people as a king and helps them get to where they need to be. Or the king of Assyria, who's there as this foil really to either help people to ascend through this process of purification and suffering, or to take down the people who haven't been valiant in their testimony of Christ and or eradicate the wicked from the world by doing this strange act of God, which you'll see throughout Isaiah. The king of Assyria is his arm, is his mouth, is his hand that strikes the people. Not that God is telling this end-time Antichrist figure to do this, but it's rather that he's allowing him to do this work, which is the wicked, eradicating the wicked. So this person personifies the burning wind that obliterates Jehovah's unrepentant people and the nations after they are warned. So remember too, these people are given ample warning, just like in Lehi's time. What did he say in chapter 1? There were many prophets that were discussing these things, but the people weren't listening. That said, going back to this idea of its bloodshed, what's the problem with the bloodshed? Well, if you go back to chapter 3, Judea and Jerusalem are deprived of their leadership, both religious and political, because people are oppressing each other. And basically what you see here in chapter 3, where it talks about will a man apprehend a kinsman of his father's house and say, you have a tunic or some kind of uniform, you're in some kind of position of authority, or were, be our leader, take charge of this ruination. So what you have here is a situation much like in the Book of Mormon, when the Gadiantans have so infiltrated their society, their politics, right, their government, that society just gets to a point where it just breaks down and you have no leadership. And they become tribal, right? It's kind of all these tribes now doing their own thing. This is the kind of fall that Isaiah is describing here. And I love how beautiful, relatively speaking, how accurately it's depicted in the Book of Mormon. And when he says in verse 11 of chapter 3, but woe to the wicked when calamity overtakes them. Woe is a word that is a covenant curse. So it's talking about people, again, who should be covenant people, and now they're getting those curses because of their deeds and their actions. And he says that in verse 14, the elders of their people, the rulers of their people, you've devoured the vineyard. The vineyard, of course, being trees, which represents people, right? And the fruit is people. You fill your houses by depriving the needy. Your leaders do this, right? I mean, how much, I actually have a statistic on that, of how much of our taxes that are meant to go to the needy actually go to them. And I want to say it's something like 1 out of every $10. And the rest of it really just kind of goes to lining the pockets of the people who are doing this, or administrative type things, let's say that. So when he says, you're oppressing my people, you're humbling the faces of the poor, it spoke earlier in chapter 1 about the widows and the fatherless. There's blood on these people's hands. I know I work with people who are injured by really powerful systems that are in place in our society, and they lobby our politicians. I mean, they're the most powerful lobbyists in our country right now. And there's a very silent genocide that's going on in our country because of this. And these are the people that I do nonprofit work with. And it's horrible. It could be your neighbor. It's people down the road. It's people in your family. And oftentimes they don't even know that they're being oppressed by these systems. They don't know why they are so unwell, why they're dying. It's these Gadiantans that have so infiltrated our society, we don't even have eyes to see sometimes that they're there and doing the things they're doing. And then, of course, things that we do even outside of our country. But it's always the poor that, as Isaiah talks about, whose circumstances will be reversed. And now those who are wealthy and living off of this oppression will be humbled, but the poor will be elevated. So I'm trying to get you caught up here as we go along. So there'll be a lot of back and forth. So over the whole site, it says in verse 5 now of chapter 4 of Isaiah, over the whole site of Mount Zion and over its solemn assembly, Jehovah will form a cloud by day and a mist glowing with fire by night, Above all that is glorious shall be a canopy. A canopy can be, it's something that covers us, like the atonement to kafar, to cover us. It's a similar idea. This, of course, is bringing up imagery of Moses with the children of Israel in the wilderness, right? There's a cloud by day, a fire by night. It's going to be the same thing. It also brings up imagery in the Book of Mormon of Nephi and Lehi in prison. When you have the wicked people surrounding them, they're enveloped by this fire. But the wicked, to them, it's actually a mist of darkness. But for the righteous, this mist is something that's like a protection from the heat of the day, is one way that's put it, from the sun, or from other things that will come up later on. And finally, verse 6, it says, it shall be a shelter, like that shelter in a vineyard, right? And a shade from the heat of the day. I just said that. Why did I say that? Because it's right here in this verse and we could have read it. A secret refuge from the downpour and from rain. Secret because it's in Zion, and people need to be brought there or invited there, so to speak. It's not everybody can just go there. There's a process of getting there, of repentance and sanctification. Now, downpour, if you'll notice here, is separate from rain. Why is that? Well, first off, of course, this is storm imagery representing the end-time king of Assyria or Babylon and his alliance, a power of chaos that pours a Sodom and Gomorrah type of Holocaust on the corrupt world. And there's a reason why he uses that word Holocaust, because it is here in the text of Isaiah. So it's not just a random word that he's pulling out. So what kind of downpour, what kind of rain? It's probably, again, because these themes come up so much, it's going to relate to this idea of fire, actually. Some kind of hail of fire, like what the Egyptians experienced with the Israelites when they had the plagues, or what the Nephites experienced at the death of Christ when the whole face of the land was changed. It's going to be something of that caliber, actually, of that magnitude, this downpour. All right, moving on to Isaiah chapter 5. Here we have one of several instances in our scriptures where there is a parable or an allegory of a vineyard. It says in verse 1, let me sing for my beloved a love song about his vineyard. So beloved would be a term that, of course, Jesus is beloved. And also there are certain people who have reached a certain level on that ladder who are called beloved. John the Beloved would be an example of that, someone who's been translated. So this is a love song about a vineyard. My beloved had a vineyard on the fertile brow of a hill. A hill, a high place, har in Hebrew, could also be like a mountain, which also could be a reference to a temple. So something interesting to consider there. He cultivated it, clearing it of stones. What are stones in Isaiah? There are stones, there are precious stones, there are also actually semi-precious stones. So there are jewels all the way down to just sort of common stones. This relates to people. This relates to levels of purification, sanctification. So when he's clearing it of stones, this could very well refer to clearing out all of that wickedness. This would, of course, go hand in hand with Jacob 5, where the servants go into the vineyard and clear out branches and burn those branches. Burn, there's that motif again, right? And planted it with choice vines. He built a watchtower in its midst. That's really important because we talked about that in lesson 1. The Tower of Babel and the tower in Doctrine and Covenants that was never built but should have been built in the middle of the garden or the vineyard. And hewed for it a wine press as well. Then he expected it to yield grapes, but it produced wild grapes, of course. Verse 3, now, O inhabitants of Jerusalem and you men of Judea, please judge between me and my vineyard. Who are Jerusalem and Judea? Well, that's us. What more could have been done for my vineyard than I have done for it? When I expected it to yield grapes, why did it produce wild grapes? So something has gone wrong here. There's still part of Israel, as it'll say later on, but it's still not producing the right kind of fruit. Now let me inform you what I will do to my vineyard. I will have its hedge removed. That hedge mentioned in Doctrine and Covenants, and that's actually represents covenants, covenant protection, as I mentioned earlier. That boundary really of the kingdom of heaven in which the Lord rules and reigns. That's where his power lies. And just think of Simba in The Lion King. Everything that the light touches is the kingdom. Everything outside of that light, that is not within God's kingdom, and there is no protection there. He says, I will have its head removed and let it be burned. I will have its wall broken through and let it be trampled. I will make it a desolation. It shall neither be pruned nor hoed, but briars and thorns shall overgrow it. Briars and thorns, again, could actually be symbolic of people who aren't vines, who aren't the good fruit. They're the antithesis to that. Moreover, I will forbid rain clouds to rain on it. Of course, in Amos, it says, the days are coming when I will send a famine through the land, not a famine of food or a thirst for water, but a famine of hearing the words of the Lord. So why would this be a thing in our day? How might that happen? Well, for those who are unrighteous and were already listening, really listening anyway. Verse 7, the vineyard of Jehovah of hosts is the house of Israel. So he just comes right out and says it. That's what this means. And the people of Judah, his cherished grove. He expected justice, but there was injustice. He expected righteousness, but there was an outcry, right? Because they have blood on their hands. I mean, even just thinking about some of our laws, I think about what abortion does to innocents, all right, to the lowly and those who are weak and can't defend themselves. I mean, there's a lot of outcry here when it comes to these things. Okay, so moving on to verse 8, woe to those who join house to house and link field to field till no place is left. And you are restricted to dwell in the centers of the land. Now, this could be in reference to right now. Obviously, we have areas in big cities. There are these urban jungles, right, where there's just no place left. But I actually, what's kind of interesting is my son just had a dream about this week, and he hasn't read this. He's trying to study Isaiah with me as I go along this year, but he's not aware of this prophecy. So he had a dream about something similar, but it was more of a lot of kind of refugees being funneled into these concrete structures that were built that weren't even homes, really, which I found really interesting. So did his dream have something to do with the future, or is it just a representation of right now? I don't know. But it's very plausible in our day and age for something like this to be the case. And I should say, when it comes to refugees, that is, again, the theme in Isaiah is you have this exile that happens just like with the Jews when Babylon takes over. There's this exile and where they have to go and be housed somewhere else besides their promised land. Okay. 9. Jehovah of hosts spoke this in my hearing. Surely many buildings shall lie desolate, large and fine houses unoccupied. A 10-acre vineyard shall yield but one bath, a homer of seed but an ephah. Now, a 10-acre vineyard, this is really interesting because you have 10 here, and then a bath essentially means less than 6 because, so that one bath is less than 6. Well, what's less than 6? Well, that's 5. So that makes me think of the 5 wise virgins versus the 5 foolish virgins. Out of 10, you only get 5. A homer is 10 also, I believe. And an ephah is only a tenth of a homer. So There you have only a tithe or a tenth that is yielded from this spiritual harvest. So within a family, within a community, maybe a ward, a neighborhood, maybe only half are cultivated and gathered in, or maybe even only a tenth. And that tenth is going to come up later because that also has some other meaning. So that'll come up in the next chapter. But woe to those who go after liquor as soon as they arise in the morning, who linger at night parties, inflamed by wine. Now, what does this sound like to you? To me, this sounds like someone like Laban. When Laban, interestingly enough, and we'll go into this maybe even a bit more later, but Laban was inflamed by wine. And you're going to see this motif throughout the Book of Mormon. I mean, really, honestly, how many times is wine and drunkenness a theme throughout the Book of Mormon? There's a reason for that. It's all throughout Isaiah as well. And Laban is just one example of this toward the beginning of the Book of Mormon. What does he represent? Well, again, wine is made from grapes, which are meant to be a harvest. Also, what else is wine referred to, or alcohol? They're called spirits. Really interesting. So which spirit inflames you, or it is burning within you? Is it the true spirit from good fruit, or is it toxic from bad or fermented fruit, I guess you could say? Moving on to 12, there are harps and lyres, drums and flutes, and wine at their banquets. They regard not what Jehovah does, nor perceive his hands, plural there, hands at work. What is hands? Well, it's a pseudonym of Jehovah's end-time servant, and his contemporary, the king of Assyria or Babylon. So right hand and left hand, right? One hand's doing one work, the other hand's doing a different work, but it's all part of the plan. And these are both people who Jehovah empowers, right? Really the right hand is empowered as a hand of deliverance, and the left hand is allowed to be empowered, I would say, by Satan as a hand of punishment. Okay. Therefore are my people exiled. So there you have it, just pretty much plain as day. There's an exile, there's an exodus that goes on here without knowing why. They don't even know, how did this happen? Oh my gosh, like we weren't even expecting this. We thought everything was good, that today was going to be like tomorrow, that kind of a thing that we read in the first 3 chapters. But no, all of a sudden it just takes them by surprise. Their best men die of famine. Their masses perish with thirst. Sheol, or sort of this idea of hell or the deep, becomes ravenous, opening its mouth insatiably. Again, mouth is going to be another one of those pseudonyms, right, of that agent of death, the king of Assyria. And of course, death and hell is that chaos motif for that level of people. And into it descend their elite with the masses, their boisterous ones and revelers. Mankind is brought low when men debase themselves. We've heard this repeated earlier in the first 3 chapters, causing the eyes of the high-minded, or you could say haughty, right, to be downcast. He's saying the same thing over and over again. But Jehovah of hosts will be exalted by a just judgment. The holy God show himself holy by his righteousness. Why is Jehovah exalted? Well, because he's completing the work that he came here to do as the God of Israel. And as he does that, he ascends completely to become like the Father, right? He hands it over to the Father, and now he has completed that journey while we are also exalted in our journey along the way. Then shall his sheep feed in their pasture, and proselytes eat in the ruins of the affluent. Well, who are his sheep? Jesus said, my sheep hear me, right? They know my voice, right? And he knows us. So these are people who are practiced in listening to his voice and following it. Proselytes, well, those are like converts, right? So these converts, yes, it's Israel, but again, they need to be truly converted to the Lord and not just maybe thinking that they're a part of his church without being really seeking and valiant in their seeking, asking, and knocking. Okay, 18 says, woe to those drawn to sin by vain attachments, hitched to transgression, like a trailer. I mean, how appropriate is that for end time kind of imagery? You know, we have our caravans and our minivans and our trailers where we hook up all of our toys and all of our equipment and things that it's just such a distraction for us. These vain attachments that take up all of our time and money. And to what end? It's right. It's like the scriptures say, don't spend your money on things of no worth. Not that all those things are bad in and of themselves, but where does your heart lie? What is your focus day in and day out? Are these the things that are the most important to you? These vain attachments, these hobbies, these interests, you know, I mean, what's more important on a Sunday? Is it going to be worshiping God or the football game? You know, that kind of a thing. Verse 19, who think, let him quickly speed up his work so we may see it. Let the plan of the Holy One of Israel soon come to pass and we will know. So again, it's this idea that we hit upon in the first lesson of, well, show us. Well, prove it. Show us. In this case, think about that. If these are people who, let's say, are going to church or worship Jesus Christ in some way, then really what I see them saying is, oh, well, yeah, when we see it, like when we see the second coming, when we see all these things, then we'll get on board, you know, then we'll really knuckle down and get on top of all this stuff. And then we'll know, right? But if you already know because of the things that are going on, because of prophecies that are being fulfilled, it's kind of too late. You're supposed to knuckle down and get on top of that before you know these things. Because by then, you're going to be one of the ones subjected to all this awfulness. And of course, we don't want people to be subjected to awfulness. We want them to come to Jehovah before so that they could be the ones who are protected in Zion. 20, woe to those who suppose what is evil to be good and what is good evil. A really famous verse here, right? They put darkness for light and light for darkness. They make bitterness sweet and sweet bitter. We talked about this in the foreword of the Book of Mormon, where we're in a time where our language is confounded because you can't even agree on just basic principles. With your neighbor, you know, to them, darkness is light, light is darkness. I just saw this tweet today because Twitter assumes that I'm going to want to see anything that has to do with the LDS community, and sometimes it's not always the best. And it was someone who got so upset that the local young women's presidency reached out to her niece, who apparently their family, this is her niece or maybe her niece's family, and I don't know, aren't going to church anymore. And so she compared these adults writing just a little hello card and, you know, just wanted to let you know who we are and we're thinking of you, really to a pedophile reaching out to a child and not letting their parents know that they're communicating this affection for this child. And I thought, wow. Could you have a more clear example of putting darkness for light and light for darkness? And what is the word here? Woe. Woe, because these are covenant people. These are covenant people who should know better. And they are twisting this and perverting it so that bitterness is sweet and sweetness is bitter. And there's a covenant curse that goes with this. Their protection will leave them. These are people who do not realize that all this luxury and this privilege that they have are the result of covenants that their ancestors made before them, that has made this promised land a land under Jehovah that has been protected, that has been plentiful and fruitful because of the blessings of God. That's what their privilege is, and that privilege will be stripped from them because they're making light dark and dark light. 21, woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and clever in their own view. Again, like Jesus said in Matthew about the latter days, that people will love a lie. You can find any information on the internet that you want to prove your point of view, and you can make very convincing arguments out of lies, but that doesn't make it true. Woe to those who are valiant, again, at drinking wine, champions at mixing liquor. So why does he have this motif in here again? If you think again about Laban and Nephi, think of the symbolism here. You have a group of covenant people who have been told to get themselves out because Babylon is going to come in and wipe their people out. So they get out, but they need the word of the Lord. And so Nephi is sent back into Jerusalem, not knowing beforehand, right, what's going to happen. And he and his brothers go to Laban and just try to convince him. And they know it's probably not a great idea to do that, but they're willing to be humiliated to that extent. And of course, Laban tells Lemuel, well, you're a robber, and he runs him out of there. And then the second time that they go, they bring him all their wealth, all their riches. So they're willing to sacrifice, even to the point of making this really big sacrifice like that. And of course, they lose it all. But the third time, they're afraid for their lives. And that's the ultimate sacrifice in this instance that I would say that Nephi's elder brothers were not willing to make, but Nephi was. He was willing to make that sacrifice of his life, and in doing so, he's empowered. So here's this same imagery of this covenant, these higher covenants that you make with the Lord on behalf of people, because what's he saying? He doesn't want to do this strange act, this strange work that the Spirit is telling him to, but he knows that for the sake of his people, he needs to do this. So he's kind of like this avenging angel that goes in and removes this person who is also a descendant of Joseph, by the way. These two are both descendants of Joseph, but one is righteous and one is not. One of them, Laban, is in a position of authority within the church, and he's over the records, but he's not doing things right. He's not listening to the Spirit, and there's probably some oppression going on here just from some of the drunkenness imagery and things like that correlate with Isaiah. And so what is Nephi commanded to do? To cut off his head. Well, isn't that interesting? Because if you go to Isaiah 22, and let's go to verses 19 and 20, it's speaking, and he's relating this to something that happened historically. So again, remember, Isaiah uses actual history to be a type for end time things. And in verse 19, it says, I will thrust you out of office. You will be expelled from your post. In that day, I will commission my servant Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah. I will clothe him with your robe and bind your girdle on him. What did Nephi do after he slayed Laban? He put his robe on, right? So there's a metaphor going on here of rulership, the right of rulership passing down. Of course, a sword is a huge thing that was passed down that had to do with that right of rulership. It says, I will appoint him your jurisdiction, and he will be a father to the inhabitants of Jerusalem and to the house of Judea. A father is a covenant term here. We mentioned earlier about how when you have an emperor who's over all these vassals and things like that, and you covenant with that emperor, you become his son. But in other ways, like Abraham, who is our father, you get to a point where you're a father of nations and things like that. So again, that's an important word there. And I will invest him with the keys of house of David. When he opens, none shall shut. And when he shuts, none shall open. Well, those are the keys like of Elijah, right? Sealing things on earth and in heaven. A great level, I would say, of spiritual power that's being described here. And really, Eliakim was a puppet ruler that was set up by the king of Babylon, right? Yes, Babylon. But it's going to be kind of like a reversal in the last days. It's not going to be some puppet ruler because Josiah was taken out in war, and then after that, their people were taken out. Interestingly, Josiah, the one that we mentioned in our last lesson, who was righteous to a certain extent, was taken out because he didn't listen to the king of Egypt, who was actually being led by the Spirit to go and kind of conquer. And so he goes out to meet him, and then that's how he's killed. And then after that, everything just kind of falls apart. But what this is foreshadowing in the last days is that person who replaces someone politically or in some kind of position of leadership is actually appointed by the Lord. And if you move to verse 23 here in this chapter 22, it says, I will fasten him as a nail in a sure place. Earlier it says the other person was a nail in a sure place, kind of like Josiah, actually. And he will be a throne of glory to the house of the Father. So that nail is removed, and another nail in a sure place is put in there, and all the glory of the Father's house will be hung on him. And then if you go to Isaiah 9, verse 14, it says, therefore Jehovah will cut off from Israel head and tail, palm top and reed in a single day. What does Nephi do? He cuts off Laban's head. And in 15, it goes on to explain that the elders or notables are the head, the prophets who teach falsehoods, the tail. The leaders of these people have misled them, and those who are led are confused. All right, so going back now to where we were in this vineyard parable, the people are exiled, but the good are pastured. They're sheep in a pasture, so it's beautiful for them. And then it says, woe to those who acquit the guilty for a bribe, but deny justice to the innocents. Why? Because the land is overrun with Gadiantons. There are so many secret combinations of people doing things for money and power and whatever to cover their sins. And the innocent are the ones who suffer because of this. As a blazing fire consumes stubble. What is fire? Chaos motif, pseudonym for Assyria. Consumes stubble, right? So these aren't plants that have really grown up to what they should be. It's stubble. As dry weeds wane before the flame, so shall their roots decay away, and their blossoms fly up like dust. So this chaos motif has to do with, I would say, that perdition category. For they have despised the law of Jehovah of hosts and reviled the words of the Holy One of Israel. There's something major going on here. It's not just like, I would say, even just sort of somebody falling away from the church. In order to have this level of condemnation, you would have to really know. You would really have to know Jehovah. Like know him on a level that most people don't, and then turn against him. Crucify him anew, as it says in certain scriptures. Therefore, the anger of Jehovah is kindled. Now, is that his anger? Well, it's the person who enacts anger on his behalf, the king of Assyria and Babylon. And he draws back his hand against them and strikes them. So this person is this weapon, really, right, that strikes these people down, these covenant people who revile Israel, the Holy One of Israel. The mountains quake and their corpses lie like litter about the streets. Yet for all this, his anger is not abated. His hand is upraised still, right? It just comes again and again. And people are like, the world's going to end, like it says, and I don't have that scripture for you, I apologize, but it's like people will think, well, the Lord's waiting until the world ends before he does anything. It's going to seem like that because it's just going to be so awful for some people. He raises an ensign to the nations and summons them from beyond the horizon. Forthwith they come swiftly and speedily. What's an ensign? Well, it's a banner like what Captain Moroni holds up. It's a certain agreement that takes place, and it can be for good or for bad. There's a good ensign and a bad one. Not one of them grows weary, nor does any stumble. They do not drowse or fall asleep. Their waist belts come not loose, nor their sandal thongs undone. Their arrows are sharp, all their bows are strung. The tread of their war horses resembles flint. Their chariot wheels revolve like a whirlwind. Is this some kind of end time military imagery? They have the roar of a lion. Again, end time kind of thing. Aroused like a lion against Jehovah's people, but you also have a lion who's Israel that can be Jehovah's instrument for good. Growling, they seize the prey and escape, and none comes to the rescue. He shall be stirred up against them in that day, even as the sea is stirred up. So fire and water motifs are going to be kind of the same idea here. And should one look to the land, there too shall be a distressing gloom, that day of gloominess, that day of darkness, that mist of darkness, like what they had in those 3 days of darkness in the Americas. For the daylight shall be darkened by an overhanging mist. Again, similar imagery there to 3rd Nephi. Now, going back to this idea, actually, this section in 4 started off with this idea of the plant of Jehovah. And then we go here back to this idea of roots decaying away. Think of the promises that are made when, if people aren't unified in the gospel, they shall be left without root or branch. These trees will just have nothing left, no connection at all to the tree of life, essentially. So something that I forgot to mention there, because this plant imagery is, of course, so huge throughout Isaiah. Okay, so let's move on to our final chapter now, and I hope some of this is helpful for you in just kind of getting the flavor of how Isaiah is interpreted. And let me know what insights you have or what you think as you're listening to some of this. Chapter 6, verse 1. In the year of King Uzziah's death, I saw my Lord seated on a throne. So chronologically speaking, chapter 6 is actually the first chapter of Isaiah, because this is when he has this vision and receives this commission. So the Lord is seated on a throne. Where is his throne? It is in the Holy of Holies with that ark and the mercy seat. So this is likely a temple vision. Highly exalted, right? In the high place. Where's the highest place? It's in the Holy of Holies. The skirt of his robe filling the sanctuary, that robe, that covering, like when Ruth covers herself with the robe of Boaz, which is interesting because one of the pillars in the original temple was named Boaz. So, yeah. Verse 2, seraphs stood by him overhead, like those 2 seraphs on either end of the ark, right? Each having 6 wings. With 2 they could veil their presence, with 2 conceal their location, and with 2 fly about. So what are wings? Well, here it seems like wings are some kind of spiritual power, some kind of spiritual energy that seems to always look like wings to people who have these kinds of visions. And they allow them certain spiritual abilities, like things to do with location and movement and things like that. So they called out to one another and said, "Most holy is Jehovah of hosts," or you could say holy, holy, holy. It's a triplicate there, is how it's done in the Hebrew. The consummation of all the earth is his glory. What is consummation? Well, when you have a consummation of marriage, that's like the ultimate climax of the coming together. It's also when something reaches its apex of what it is meant to be, right? Becoming its utmost. So the earth being glorified, becoming not only terrestrial but celestial. That consummation of the earth with glory is his glory. Because really, like I mentioned earlier, his role is to become like the Father. So in a sense, he needs us to be glorified, to become what he's meant to be, and we need him to be glorified so we can become what we need to be. The threshold shook to its foundation at the sound of those who called, and a mist filled the temple at the sound of those who called, excuse me. Then I thought, woe is me. So what's he thinking here? That he's a covenant cursed person. I have been struck dumb. You could also word that as being undone or unmade. Kind of like when Alma realizes how wicked he is, and just the idea of being in the presence of God, he just wanted to disappear, turn into that dust, that chaff, and become nothing, because it's too painful to bear the idea of being in the presence of the Lord when you are in sin. That's why the way to the tree of life was guarded for Adam and Eve, because to be in that presence of that tree of life while still being in a state of sin is just unbearable, and would probably ultimately lead to that kind of a destruction in a sense. For I am a man of unclean speech, and I live among a people of unclean speech. So words have power. I have seen the King, Jehovah of hosts, with my own eyes. So he's like, there's no way I can live now, like this. But luckily there's mercy, because he's at where? The mercy seat. Then one of the seraphs flew to me carrying an ember, which he had taken with tongs from the altar, which I find interesting. Why is there an altar with embers in the Holy of Holies? That's not where they burned sacrifices. Touching it to my mouth, he said, see, this has touched your lips. Your sins are taken away. So this idea of a purification takes place. Your transgressions atoned for. So it's made right. It's covered. Then I heard the voice of my Lord saying, whom shall I send? Who will go for us? And I replied, here am I, send me. That sounds really similar to the beginning of the plan, doesn't it? Here am I, send me. And the Lord says, I will choose, this one. I'll send him. And he said, go and say to these people, go on hearing, but not understanding. Go on seeing, but not perceiving. Make the heart of these people grow fat, dull their ears, and shut their eyes, lest they see with their eyes and hear with their ears, understand in their heart, and repent and be healed. Now, why is he saying this? Does God not want people to repent? Does God not want people to see and hear? No. But we know from so many examples in the scriptures that when righteous prophets like Lehi prophesy truth, instead of it softening people's hearts, it hardens them. Instead of them listening, they double down on their lies, on loving those lies, right? They double down on just turning a blind eye and not really looking and seeing the truth. And why is it so bad to have a fat heart? Well, if you go to Leviticus 7, so let's go there right now, actually. Here you have instructions for what's known as the guilt offering. And in this guilt offering, the animal that is sacrificed has its blood splattered against all the sides of the altar, which is different from other kinds of offerings. So later on, we're going to come across scriptures that say he shall sprinkle many nations. So think of that in terms of this guilt offering on behalf of the people. The priest will then offer all its fat on the altar, including the fat of the broad tail, the fat around the internal organs. That would include the heart, the two kidneys. Kidneys are an important organ in the scriptures, and the fat around them near the loins and the long lobe of the liver. So these are to be removed, and then they burn them on the altar as a special gift presented to the Lord. This is the guilt offering. So this is a special gift presented to the Lord. This is the guilt offering, and it needs to be eaten or consumed in a sacred place where it is most holy. This idea of most holy is going to come up at the end of chapter 6 of Isaiah here. So this is what he's talking about when he's talking about that their hearts are fat. They should be offering up these offerings, right? And what does that mean, though, symbolically? What does it mean to trim away the fat? In John 15, it says that Jesus is speaking here, says, I am the true grapevine, and my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch of mine that doesn't produce fruit, right? Just like we've been talking about. And he prunes the branches that do bear fruit so they will produce even more. Now, we might think of this again in context of, oh, he's cutting out these people that are unrighteous and getting rid of them. But look what Jesus goes on to say here. You have already been pruned. You are the ones who are pruned, right? And pruned and purified by the message I have given to you. So we are the ones being pruned. And what's being cut off from us? Well, you have a clue here in this third verse. The purification and the pruning happens by the message or the words of Christ. So what he's pruning away here are false beliefs, false ideas. What is it that the people have that's making their ears dull, making them blind, making their hearts fat, so that have waxed hard, like it says in Alma 35, that nothing can get in? It's false beliefs and false things that have been taught to them that they cling to, that they're not willing to let go of and just listen to the pure truth that comes directly from heaven. I could go into so much of that, but I won't. But I will say it is our job when we're receiving any instruction from people in positions of leadership, even within the church. And I wasn't planning on reading this, but I feel like I should. So let me just say this here. Ezra Taft Benson said, 6 of the original 12 apostles selected by Joseph Smith were excommunicated. The 3 witnesses to the Book of Mormon left the church. 3 of Joseph Smith's counselors fell. One even helped to plot the prophet's death. A natural question that might arise would be, if the Lord knew in advance that these men would fall, as he undoubtedly did, why did he have his prophet call them to such high office? The answer is to fulfill the Lord's purposes. For even the Master followed the will of the Father by selecting Judas. President George Q. Canna suggested an explanation too when he stated, perhaps it is his own design that faults and weaknesses should appear in high places in order that his saints may learn to trust in him and not in any man or men. And this would parallel Nephi's warning, put not your trust in the arm of flesh. It is from within the church that the greatest hindrance comes. Now, why would that be? Well, because a lot of times the doctrines of men creep in. I mean, we're taught every day by, just lay teachers, right? We're not paid. It is what it is. You get what you pay for sometimes. And sometimes these things just perpetuate and perpetuate. And, we like to think that we're safe if we just listen to every single word that comes from the pulpit at conference as though it is 100% true. But these people are fallible and they can make mistakes. And it's our job, and Brigham Young has some great quotes with regard to that too, but I can't find that right now, but that it's our job to determine what is correct by the Spirit, so we're practiced at it, so that when a test does come our way of this magnitude, we know what is true and what is not. So allow the Lord to directly teach you what is true and pure doctrine. And of course, listen to people who are inspired by God, but the best way to sustain them is to do your part in having that relationship with Christ so you know what is true and what is not. And therefore, if they do make mistakes, if they do things that aren't right, you don't perpetuate that unrighteousness in the church. Okay, moving on, he says, remain in me and I will remain in you, for a branch cannot produce fruit if it's severed from the vine. You can't remain fruitful unless you remain in me. And that is what it means to be a plant of Jehovah. You are firmly in Christ and he is in you. Okay, so we're at the last half of this last chapter here for this week. And it says, and I replied, for how long, my Lord? And he said, until the cities lie desolate and without inhabitant, the houses without a man, and the land ravaged to ruin, for Jehovah will drive men away, and great shall be the exodus from the centers of the land. Remember those centers where you had large housing units of people. And while yet a tenth of the people, remember the Both and the Ephah. Oh, by the way, one thing I forgot to mention is Both is the same word for daughter. So those who produce fruit, again, it's that imagery of the female and the daughters of Zion. But also, again, like he keeps saying, like a lot of men are going to be killed, and a lot of this could be a female remnant. I mean, and actually, if you look at Iring's talk in 2020 to the women, it kind of indicates that too. So something to consider. Anyway, so a tenth of the people remain in it. What is that? That's a tithe. That's a holy offering. But they shall be burned. And like the terebinth or the oak, when it is felled, whose stump remains alive. So in other words, there are certain trees like the terebinth or this oak, you can cut it all the way down basically to the roots, and it's still going to produce shoots, and it'll still produce a new tree and go on living because its roots are still alive. So shall the holy offspring be what is left standing. And really, by holy, this would be a most holy offering. So let's actually go to Numbers 18, and let's go down to verse 9. This is talking about these offerings that are brought to the priests in the temple. And when Israel brings these offerings, this is really their inheritance, so to speak, because the Levites don't have a land of inheritance. Their offerings, or their inheritance, is the offerings that the people bring to them, and that's how they get their subsistence and their living. And it says here that with regard to the sons of Aaron, that they are allotted the portion of the most holy offering that is not burnt on the fire. So you have this tithe that's brought, that's burnt, and then there's a tithe of a tithe that is reserved for these priests or high priests, the portion of the most holy offering, including all these different, the guilt offering that we just mentioned, along with the grain and sin offerings, like that grain, that harvest that's gathered in as an offering. That's us. And it will be most holy, and that's your inheritance. And it's consumed. Okay. So this is what Isaiah is saying. And as we continue on in our study of Isaiah, you will see that this burning motif with the king of Assyria, a lot of it is his doing, and that it's actually his plan to eradicate 90% of the population, but you have a tithe that are protected and left behind. And then of that tithe, you have a most holy offering that is celestial, and that ultimately is that tree of life that remains in a celestialized earth at the end of this creation of this earth, this creation story, at the end of the millennium. Okay, so that was a whole lot to go over there. I hope that as you go through in your study of Isaiah this next week, that you'll also start seeing how these images and ideas relate to your Book of Mormon story or study, and also how it relates to you personally, and understand what your part in all of this is. So I'm going to leave this with you in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.